Do you see me typing? Oh, then you're in the wrong one. Yeah. Oops. Yep. Okay. You already talked about the last. Oh, I see. Oh, wow. He's on it. Great. Why did you erase what I did? There. Why? Oh. Okay, we're at time. Those who are remote, can you hear us okay?
Yes, all good.
All right. Can you see the slides that are being shared?
Yes.
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 Excellent. Okay, let's go ahead and get started. Welcome to the last session and the last day of the IETF 114. Yay! So you are in the really simple cloud identity management. So I'm not going to read the official name because that's what we do. So this is what we are covering in the session. If you're not expecting to talk about Scim, you're probably in the wrong session. Next slide. By now, you should all be very well familiar with how the IETF works and the participation, which we note in the note well. So I will just skip and let you read it through the meeting materials. Next slide. I do want to provide some meeting tips, and I know it's the last day, but we've been asked as chairs to remind everybody of the meeting tips. So for those who are here physically in the venue, make sure to sign into the session via either the little video icon or the on-site tool icon on the web page under Scim. That way there's some binding that acknowledges that you were present in the session. Please use the Meet Echo to join the MIC queue, especially those that are here present. That way we can respect the order for those that are participating remotely as well. For those here who are present, turn off your audio and video. That way we don't get feedback. And the other important one is please make sure you keep your masks on. The only ones that can remove their masks are those who come up here and present where pink X marks the spot. That is the only instance in which you can take your mask off. For those who are participating remotely, make sure you have your audio and video off unless we, the chairs, recognize you to speak or present during the session. And we still continue to recommend that you use your headset. Next slide. Okay, I think we're all friendly in this room, so this is just a reminder for the code of conduct. Treat each other with respect, keep it professional, keep the discussion on point. Next slide. Okay, so to the orders at hand. Thank you, Yotis and Pam, for being the Jabber scribes, really the note takers. I guess I can update it now since we're no longer using Jabber. The minutes, the link is there for those who want to track the note takers, and feel free to augment if you see things that are missing, so anybody can go in and edit the minutes as well. The meeting material, there's the link there, and hopefully if you're already here, you know the Meet Echo link. Next slide. For the agenda today, we do have a packed set of items that we want to cover. Rather than going through the actual drafts, I've asked Pam and Phil, who has the first adopted draft, that being Scim events, to just give a brief update of where we are with those particular documents. For the protocol and schema, we've had a lot of discussion on the particular items that we want to focus on. So rather than just saying we don't quite have a draft yet, Danny and Janelle, if she's on, will talk about the different particular features, capabilities, use cases that need to be addressed. Given that there was sufficient discussion on the email thread and how we do beyond the actual bootstrapping or provisioning, how we do the updates, the scalability and performance for those updates. That's my terminology in the thread. There's been discussions about filtering, how we do coordination. We've allotted more time to talk about that, and the other term that was used was pagination. So we'll spend a significant amount of time doing that. Phil, I forgot to update the agenda. That was my bad. I was supposed to update the slides. So what is in the actual agenda under the Meet Echo is correct. So Phil, we're giving you 5 minutes to just give an update on the draft itself, but we're giving you 15 minutes. So Phil has uploaded in the meeting materials, there is a presentation that Phil will walk us through for us to kickstart the discussion of what the use case is that leads us to the discussion of pagination, filtering, eventing, and so on. And then we've allocated pretty much the rest of the time to discuss and hopefully get to some points that we can reach consensus on a path forward for those items. So any comments or updates, and I apologize, I meant to update the, I did anyway, I don't know why it didn't go, on the agenda. If not, yeah. Oh, thank you. So that is the updated agenda that I have on the PowerPoint, just didn't get the update. If there's no comments or further agenda bashing, we can go ahead and get started. So with that, Pam, you want to come up and give us an update on the use cases document?
Hi, everybody. Can you hear me okay? Looks good.
Yes.
Yes. So the number one news is we have a use cases document. Dun, dun, dun. But we have it in HackMD format right now. The link is going to go in the notes. And so we're not going to discuss it today because obviously no one's had a chance to review it. But we will start the process right away of reviewing that document on the list. So it's work that we literally got done here at IETF. Let me just tell you quickly about the rationale that we're using. This was part of the review we did at the last plenary as well. What you're going to see in there is terminology. We've tried to define terminology that was not defined in the protocols themselves. So in RFC 76, 43, or 44. So you're going to see a definition of a Scim service provider, right? And of a Scim client, and of what Scim schema is, and of what the Scim protocol is. Where possible, we've taken those from the protocols, copied them across, and then we're trying to boil them down to make them very brief. but they may be wrong, and there may be cases where actually there is a definition, and it just didn't come up as the authors of this new draft were casting about. There are also definitions. So there's basically two types of definitions. One is, the things used in the protocols. The second one is industry definitions that would be relative to the use cases where people might implement Scim. So those are absolutely up for debate. I put in slightly provocative definitions so that people would know to react to them. So don't be afraid to go in and change them. That's the whole idea, is that we iterate. And then the second piece is about, so the concepts are generally around units of work that implementers might want to perform. And then the last piece is business scenarios. And the goal there is to define end-to-end activities that an implementer might look at and say, yes, this is something I want to do. So the link is in the Meet Echo. I will leave it at that so we stay on time. And if anyone wants to take the pen or do a large revision, we're going to have the HackMD open for a couple of hours so that anyone who's here and has time can do it themselves or even come talk to us. So Danny and I are the originators, and then we did do a review in the Scim side meeting yesterday, so others who happen to be in the room have had some review of it. How's that? Any questions before I get caned off the stage? Anyone online who would like to ask a question?
Feel free to get on the queue if you have any comments.
Okay, perfect. Looking forward to feedback on the list then.
Danny's on the queue.
There we go.
Just one quick addition to what Pam said. Yeah, we'll leave the HackMD open for a bit, and then either on today or Monday or somewhere in between, we'll publish the first version to the data tracker.
Okay, yeah, and that's at the point where we'll post to the list.
Yep, just a reminder, when you put it in the data tracker, just post to the mail list and solicit feedback.
We will definitely do that. Okay, thanks
Awesome.
everyone.
Thanks, Pam. Okay, next up we have Janelle and Danny.
Hello, everybody. Can you hear me? Good? Cool. Okay, so yeah, is Janelle in the chat? I didn't see her. I'm assuming I'll just... Cool. Okay, so yeah, my name's Danny Zollner, along with Janelle, who unfortunately couldn't be here today. We have sort of thrown our hats in the ring to be the editors for a big body of work that comprises changes and additions to the Scim schemas and protocols, both eventually the main documents themselves, as well as helping to shepherd a bunch of extensions that will add new functionality. Next slide, please. So our rough agenda for this chunk of time that we have some topics that we'd like to talk about that do currently have drafts, although several of them have expired. One or two have been revived in the past day or two. And then there's a whole bunch of topics that we'll move on to that don't currently have drafts. And just at a conceptual level, I'd like to talk about, see if anybody has opinions, interest, and if anybody wants to stand up and volunteer to either author, edit, just contribute ideas, whichever. So yeah, we have this agenda here, and we can just move on to the next slide, and we'll dive straight into cursor-based pagination. So yeah, first our section of topics for the existing drafts. Next slide, please. So we do have a draft that's out there. It's expired currently by Matt Peterson on cursor-based pagination. The draft location is listed here. At a high level, it introduces a few new parameters for queries and response attributes. So things like cursor, count, next cursor, and previous cursor. And at the high level, the use case is to improve massive scale operations when a client interacting with a Scim service provider needs to be able to traverse a very large set of results. So sometimes we're looking at millions of results. Over on the right-hand side, we have an example. Just get users count equals 10, and the key thing is highlighted there, where the additions would be that next cursor and the cursor, when provided in the query URL for a subsequent query, would return another set of results. So I guess I'll sort of pause at this point. If anybody has any comments or questions, I believe we have time carved out later specifically to talk about pagination. So actually, we probably should have skipped this slide, but yeah, I know there's been some discussion on the mailing list about this approach versus a Scim events-based approach, but we can cover that in the allotted time later on in the agenda, I guess. So without any questions in the queue, I think we can just move to the next slide, please. And so next, one of the topics that's in the charter is multi-valued attribute pagination and filtering. Phil Hunt, who's on the on the call, he wrote this draft. Phil, if you would prefer to speak to this at any point, feel free. Okay, Phil's in the queue.
Go ahead, Phil.
Yeah, it's still there. I think it's based on extending the complex multi-value attribute, sub-attribute filtering and applying the same technique to the attributes parameter. And in addition to the attribute, sub-attribute filters, then you can also say what pages of that you want. So those two things kind of go together. And it's really in case of the group saying, hey, we like it, or there's enough interest to do it. The only complex thing that really came up in the past when we first proposed it was how to deal with knowing how many rows there are. And that's up for some discussion, and that's probably about the only thing we have to sort through on that spec.
Okay.
And to clarify, just so everybody's clear, what we're talking about is paging of attribute value roles, not paging of resources. So those are very different things. Thanks.
Okay. Yeah, thank you, Phil. So yeah, the most common example of where multi-value attribute pagination would come in would be if you have a group with 1 million members and you don't want to receive one response with a list of all 1 million members, but instead break it up into smaller chunks. And that's exemplified in the request on the right-hand side of this. I know from the mailing list, there's also been some feedback from Matt Peterson, who again cannot be here today, on a different approach, which would be to represent group memberships as sort of as two different sets of resources, like / group memberships and / user groups, to represent the memberships in a group and the groups that a user is a member of, respectively. I personally don't have a strong opinion on one way or the other on which way to go. That's just the other sort of idea, I guess, that's been put out there. And Phil, go ahead.
Hi. There already is an attribute under the user profile called groups, which you can find out what groups a user is a member of. So we don't need a new object for that. That's already in the spec. Or were you talking about something else?
I think he was talking about something slightly different. It was an approach to not need multi-value attribute pagination. I believe the approach was, so rather than having, because in both cases today, group memberships as well as the user groups attribute that sort of displays the other direction of all the groups associated with the user, those are both multi-valued attributes on an object. And so when you have large series of results, you run into the situation where you would need the multi-valued attribute pagination graph. Whereas the proposal from Matt Peterson was to create new sort of top-level Scim resources that represented the memberships either as members of a group or groups that a user is a member of as resources or like results that will be returned, so that you can use existing pagination logic rather than multi-value attribute pagination. I don't know if you re-entered the queue, Phil, but if you entered.
No, I left them on.
No.
So the question is whether we should postpone this for the apprehension session.
Yeah, and I think I agree with Nancy. I don't know why I was blanking on her name. To maybe postpone this sort of section on pagination. So yeah. Anyways, at a high level, that's this topic at least. If we can move to the next slide, please. So one of the other drafts that has been out there for a while, it's also currently expired, is a draft on soft deletion. It's a fairly straightforward draft. It adds a new resource to, or sorry, a new attribute to resources, which I believe is soft deleted. And then you can also query with, and correct me if I'm wrong, Phil, I may have gotten this one wrong. I know you were an author on this, even if Cortez has the name on the draft. But there's also a query parameter that is soft deleted equals true. I guess rather than attributes or whatever it is, the other form of filtering where you're explicitly calling like a filter rather than is soft deleted being the parameter.
So Danny, let's pause for a couple minutes because Phil, unless you were able to capture it, you can go ahead and respond. But I'm going to ask Danny to pause for a couple minutes because we have an agent
Okay.
person trying to fix the audio issues. Go ahead, Phil.
Okay. My understanding is that the issue right now is that the Scim contract says, the Scim protocol, which is essentially alcohol contract, says that once you delete a resource, if you try to do a get resource, you're supposed to return a 404. It's supposed to act like it's gone. And I think the idea of a parameter that sort of says, yes, I know I'm querying a deleted resource, but I want you to return it to me anyway. That's basically essentially what's going on. I haven't delved much further into it than that. It was really something Morteza was looking for. There may be other ways to do this, but the key is that if you're doing a get against an object that was deleted, the server would normally say 404 not found. That's what it's supposed to do. That's what we decided. So now we're trying to say yes, but also check to see if it was a soft delete and return it if it is. So we have to have something to override the behavior.
Okay, we're going to pause. I'm looking at the AV folks.
One thing I'll say is we should also think about whether that's a security issue that only certain clients should be able to execute that query.
We're still listening, Phil. It's just I'm pausing because we have two AV people here working now.
That's all I wanted to say is there might be a security consideration that being able to troll through old links might cause problems, and it might not be something that a normal client can do. I haven't thought through it though.
Yep. No, that's well noted, and it's been noted in the minutes. So thank you for that.
Testing.
Is that better for those who are remote? Can you hear Danny any better?
I can answer Daryl's question.
Go ahead and answer Daryl. But
Okay, so the question was, what is the expectation? Go ahead. What is the expectation of delete on a resource with soft delete equals true parameter? Is it a no-op or a hard delete? That's something that the spec would have to define, because the first delete that you did, which is an HTTP delete, turned it into a soft delete because your server supports that. Then you'd have to ask the question, well, if I delete it again, does that wipe it out? So that's something the document would need to, spec would need to describe.
Yeah, it may already. I was looking through it earlier this week. I believe it says if you do another delete on the resource while using the soft deleted equals true parameter, then that transforms it from soft deletion to true hard deletion. But if not,
Okay, so Pam wants to speak, but as a minute taker, she hasn't had the chance, so I'm going to give her a pass. Go ahead, Pam. Oh, she did put her name.
So I think there's an issue there because it may be that the client isn't capable of full deleting like that. So that, you know, just because you want it to be hard deleted doesn't mean it's going to get hard deleted. So I assume there's some interaction there.
I recall, sorry, I guess this is Nancy as an individual. I recall the discussions at Identiverse that there needed to be clear distinction and definition of soft delete versus hard delete. So I think that's something that needs to be pointed out.
I would agree. And I think to the point that Pam raised, whether or not the Scim service provider is capable of either soft deletion or hard deletion or both is probably something that could be straightened out with, if it doesn't already exist in the core schema or the core protocol today, or protocol for normal hard deletion, both would probably be represented inside of service provider config elements as part of an extension of that.
Okay. We've got Michael Prorok. Sorry if I butchered your name on the queue.
No, totally fine. Michael Perk here. Yeah, I just wanted to state the clear need for a soft delete because there are a lot of audit log type scenarios and read-only type of pen stuff. For instance, some of the items we're looking at in Skit and some other areas where there's going to be a hard overlap that may require the ability to say, yes, this is soft deleted, but it may not actually be possible to clear that piece of information.
So now I'll speak as a chair. We just need to have alignment on what it means to do soft delete versus hard delete. Yes.
Yeah, and as a chair, would you say that needs to be figured out in the individual draft before it's submitted, or potentially by the working group?
You can put it in the draft.
Okay. Yeah.
Go ahead, Phil.
I'm a little bit confused because it's always true right now that a server can soft delete behind the scenes. So the client asks for delete, and the protocol says that as far as the client is concerned, the object is deleted. Now, whether it actually is or not, that's only something the service provider knows. So really the issue is, why does the client need to request a soft delete or not? That's a policy of the service provider, not of the client. So maybe we need to work on the use case, because current signaling as a contract is if the client asks for delete, as far as it knows, it's a hard delete. Whether it actually is deleted or not, that's there. And the requirement I understood before was really the case is during life cycle management of the user, you want to open up the opportunity to resurrect the user to maintain the resource identifiers and stuff so that links don't get broken. That was sort of the broad use case that I understood from Morteza, was that resurrection becomes possible. And again, the client doesn't know that. It's just that the workflow on the server will say, okay, I've already got a match for that based on hidden data that it knows about, and you resurrect that account, and now that account just exists. So the next time the client queries it, it's there. So I'm not sure I understand why a client needs to flag it at all.
This is Aaron. I have a clarifying question on the protocol that we're looking at on the screen. Is this protocol only describing the ability for a client to query a possibly deleted record to have it potentially return that actually it does still exist? Is that the idea with this protocol? We're not actually describing the ability for soft deletion to happen in general, but it looks like, if I'm looking at what's on the screen correctly, it's just the ability to query for soft deleted records.
That's how I understood it, Aaron.
I would agree. We're not defining the actual mechanism of sort of soft deletion and what it means to the application, but rather if the application has their own concept of soft deletion, that that term at least is, I think, at least somewhat in agreement, across a lot of identity systems. It might be too controversial a statement, but at that point, that it's this draft is defining a way for the client to learn that from the Scim service provider.
Go ahead, Pam.
One thing I think we have to keep in mind is that in a world where the Scim server is always the authoritative source and the Scim client is always not, then that's fine. But in our case, like we now have cases where the Scim client can be the authoritative server, right? So the question becomes, if, for example, if it's your IDaaS platform that is the Scim client, right, there could very well be a use case for them to be more prescriptive and to demand a hard delete.
That sounds like a different draft in that case then, right? Yeah, okay.
So again, this gets back to the use cases and clarification and requirements. Sorry, I'm trying to.
Hi, Phil again. Hi, Phil again.
Well, Connor was next in the queue.
Connor first.
Hi, yeah, this is Connor from Okta, and I would just kind of echo, I think this would need more details on the use case, because even for that sort of resurrecting a temporarily disabled user case, like there's already the status field that we have on the objects that can be used for that. So I would be curious to see like what specifically would need that soft delete info as opposed to that.
Go ahead, Phil.
Yeah, I was going to add that it might not be so much as a special flag, or we could look at it, but it might be that when you go to do an add, you want to say, I want to re-add with I want to create the record, but I want to resurrect the old identifier. That's really the issue, because under Scim protocol right now, when you create a user, the Scim server is required to assign the identifier where the client can't say it. What the client's saying is, I want you to restore your old identifier, which was this. And that might change the problem a little bit. Or change the solution a little bit.
Does anybody else have any, I guess, comments, questions on soft deletion, or should we move on?
I think we should just go ahead and move on.
Okay. Also, I guess test people remote. Is this microphone working okay? Cool. I guess. Okay.
Those who are remote? Yeah, go ahead.
Cool. Oh boy, this is small text for for being here. So I this slide has a few suggested additions for soft deletion. I think given the current state of, we're not sure that this is the right fit just at a concept level. We could probably skip this slide. If anybody's interested, they can go review the meeting materials later.
You want to try coming here and giving your mask up? Oh, no. Go ahead.
So yeah, I think we can proceed to the next slide. We'll okay. So the next topic, and this is, I believe, the last one where there is an either current or expired draft available. This is a draft that I wrote late last year on roles and entitlements. The URL is definitely wrong there. Oops. But at a high level, this draft aimed to add 2 new resource types to the schema, which would be /roles and /entitlements. The purpose of that is to provide a way for a Scim client to go and query a list of all of the available values for either roles or entitlements that would be accepted for the respective values on the user resource. So a problem that exists today is, especially in applications that are linked to a Scim server, where we'll call them the multi-tenanted applications. Typically, they're SaaS in nature. The customer, or like on a per tenant basis, can customize what roles are available in their application. And the Scim client today has no like protocol or schema, Scim standard way to go and discover what are the available values that will work in these requests. And it therefore either creates sort of an out-of-band management problem, where if a new role is created in the app, it also has to be created somewhere else, or it leads to a whole bunch of failed requests when the Scim client doesn't have the correct data and is sending requests to the Scim server that are deemed invalid due to disallowed values. On the right-hand side, there's an example. It's a resource, very basic. Has things like value display, just as the user resources roles or entitlement attribute would on that side. I 2 nights ago published a new version, which we're currently at increment 0.2. That actually adds a few new features as well. I didn't include those on this slide, but those features revolve around sort of role or entitlement hierarchy. In the event that there might be a role that is actually made up of several smaller or like less permissioned roles, so that you can understand sort of how the different how the structure of permissions or roles or licenses or whatever the thing that is being represented works in that application, as well as a few attributes that help to represent the availability of those on a numerical basis. It's more towards probably the use case of entitlements, thinking of instances where entitlements may be representing a paid license in a service, and you may only have 100 or 1,000 or whichever number of seats. So the ability to know what is the total number of users that can have this value and how many currently have it were also added in the 0.2 version. And that's all I have to say on this one, if anybody has any questions. If not, I think we
If
can.
there's no feedback, we can move on.
Yeah, and to close out that section, I think the hope is that for some of these topics, maybe we slow down a little on, say, soft deletion and figure it out as a group. Given that there are current drafts, I would like discussion to pick back up on the mailing list, and for us to get to a point where we can do calls for adoption on some of these existing drafts, or figure out why they can't be adopted and go fix those problems, so that we can start, as the working group, having more adopted drafts to work through. So just keep an eye out on the mailing list. There will be some emails pertaining to most of these drafts that we just covered in the next few weeks. Next slide, please. So going through some other topics. So these, I think for the most part, align with the charter that we have for the working group today. However, there are no drafts that have been written. So this first one is around change detection or Delta query. The use case would be similar to the cursor-based pagination. It's a tool to help with large-scale sort of manipulation and tracking of data. It's particularly needed in pool-based scenarios where the data is sort of maintained and changes on the Scim service provider and is then being retrieved for some other purpose by the Scim client, such as a human resources provider where their data is being retrieved for use elsewhere. Currently, there's and I think an option to do a get based on the meta.lastModified attribute to detect changes. However, that doesn't fit all use cases, as systems that are sort of like distributed systems, such as a lot of cloud like as a service systems, may have time drift that causes problems with getting extremely accurate sets of results based on time. So with the Delta query, it would help to provide a way to accurately get all changes since the last time that a request was generated. The example at the bottom is just one possible format it could take. Get users with the parameter of Delta token equals, and then a randomly generated GUID that I put in there. I know on the mailing list there have been some other conversations, and there are other thoughts on how to approach this. This is just one of them. And I see Michael's in the queue. I'll move from this microphone because he's here in person.
Yeah, thanks, Aaron. Just wanted to speak to the usefulness of this, especially when we look at some of the bulk update type nature of the items we're dealing with, or mapping over to real world type scenarios, digital identities. It can be quite useful to be able to say, hey, I need to see every company, for instance, that like an entity was registered for and an identity was registered for since the last time there was an update or some event that occurred, right? So it's a highly useful capability. So.
Is this microphone still? Okay, so switching microphones. Cool. Thanks, AV guys. Yeah, the next topic would be the human resources schema. This is also part of our charter. Given the close relationship that data originating from human resources or human capital management providers tends to have with other identity systems, and we are system for cross-domain identity management after all. There's a desire to get a unified generic human resources schema for Scim, so that human resources providers can start labeling the same sets of data that they may have in the same way, rather than everybody labeling different attributes, different things when they serve the same purpose. So this one does not have a draft. I've mentioned this recently on the mailing list. I believe one of the critical things that we will need here is to get involvement from a significant number of human resources providers to provide their feedback on sort of the shape of this schema, as if it's just sort of identity knowledgeable people who don't necessarily exist in the human resources or human capital management world. We might get it wrong, and it might not actually help with the problem we're trying to solve. Any questions on this one? Okay, in that case, I will move to the next one, please. So the next topic would be account status context. And so this lines up with the discussion on soft deletion pretty well. Currently, the only real information that you have about a user's status in a lot of ways is the active attribute, which is a Boolean. So it's active, true, or false. There's a proposal to expand this out, perhaps with a new, let's say, complex attribute to support active that would be called something like account status, where you can see things about that user. Are they pre-hire? Are they on leave, unpaid or paid? Or have they been terminated? There's, I think, a desire to align some of these states with states from the shared signals community as well. Yeah, so this is a topic that we would like to see a draft for as well, and I believe it is also a part of our charter. I'll pause for 5 seconds for hands to go up. Otherwise, next slide, please. Okay, so I think we're down to the last 2 slides for this section. So there's an improvement to the protocol that I would like to see around reference URLs, and there have been discussions in some of our interim meetings before, possibly also on the mailing list. So the key example that that I have would be the photos attribute in the core user schema. So the photos attribute is a complex attribute, but underneath that, sort of the main sub value in that complex attribute is an attribute of a data type that is called reference, which there are actually very few of in the Scim spec relative to things like strings. So a reference attribute needs to point to another resource somewhere, and there's going to be multiple types. They're in the schema spec. You can go look it up. The problem with things that are of URL format specifically, like the URL to somebody's profile picture, is that in a cloud, like SaaS internet-based world, the systems are communicating over the internet. So if as a cloud IDP, I am on one side of a transaction that's happening over the internet, and I am communicating all of the user profile pictures for an organization via Scim, and I'm giving URLs, the service provider that is being told those URLs will then need to go back and ask for the pictures. The spec doesn't actually clearly specify today, the existing Scim spec, on what happens after those URLs are provided. Does the app that's consuming them just sort of hot link to them forever? Or is the Scim service provider expected to do like a fetch and then store it somewhere locally on their side? So if the cloud app represented by the service provider wants to hot link forever, that becomes a problem. I don't think it would be a very popular solution either for performance or just cost reasons. But the actual big problem that I'd like to see there, see us solve here, is for these URLs. If as the cloud IDP, I provide a URL, something.jpg open to the internet, how do I make sure that only the Scim service provider that I sent it to is able to access it? The Scim standard today doesn't talk at all about securing these URLs. I believe the intention of the original authors was to leave it up to the implementers. Unfortunately, that's led to not, there's not a whole lot of use of profile pictures between cloud IDPs and service providers today. Bill?
My understanding is it's just a URL. So if you are going outside the spec and prefetching the data as a service provider, yeah, you're opening up a can of worms, because now you are republishing the picture. So what was discussed originally was just publish the URL, and it's the client that receives it that has to have the credentials to go and pull it. But the spec is silent on that for a reason, because there wasn't consensus on that. So it's just a URL. It makes sense that some will want to add value and do that, but then they sort of have to solve all those problems that you're alluding to. That's just the historical perspective.
Yeah, thanks, Phil. Yeah, I agree that it's a can of worms. There's a lot of sort of questions there about who should be doing what. I think that a consensus is needed, though, and that's sort of what I'm calling for here. Just because looking at the number of collaboration apps that exist out there today, there's just in sort of anecdotal experience for myself, I've had a number of conversations where folks that have that I've helped with integrations would really like to consume profile pictures, but there's not a way that we deem secure today. This is me speaking as a product manager at Microsoft. There's a security problem that we would like to see solved here. Just we don't feel that it's quite there yet, and we need a scalable way to do this versus leaving certain decisions up to any given set of implementers that are working together. It's the interop problem essentially.
Yeah, go ahead, Ori.
Hey, Ori Steele from Transmute. I guess I've seen versions of this problem solved in a couple different ways. So I'll just share, briefly some of the
Hello, those remote? Can you hear us? Well, I closed it just
Oh, okay.
because we were running kind of.
Yes, we can, or I can, and see you again.
Woohoo.
Excellent. I was
All
just
right, so already,
I was just saying, sometimes the network can go down and you'll be trying to resolve your URL reference and it won't work. And so one thing I've seen folks do in that case is embed URL content. So going from a reference to a value with data URIs or things like that. And then the other system is a trusted high available proxy. And there's privacy issues on both sides of this problem. So I just wanted to share that in other sort of higher security scenarios where you're worried about dereferencing being observable, you might want the embed by value solution and not the dereference solution.
So this is Jos Baum from Rodrigo. I just wanted to say my take on this is that even though there was no consensus, as I just heard, that at least it should be in the security considerations, probably. To just mention, I don't know, something about it.
Okay. So yeah, this one, as we even just heard from the feedback, I think there's a lot of potential solutions on how to address this. I don't have a great one to propose myself, but it's a topic that I would really like to see a group of people find a good scalable solution to. So I'll try to continue this topic on the mailing list, but I would really love to get a draft written at some point for this. Next slide, please.
okay, just so it's on the notes, Phil commented on the chat that it could fit in the best practices.
Such as the slide right now. Yeah, and so this is, I believe, the final slide of sort of the random smorgasbord of drafts that are there.
I have closed the queue.
Okay, so yeah, this is the last in the pile of assorted topics and drafts. So I believe there's interest in sort of tightening up some aspects of the Scim standard with regards to security. The Scim was written 2014, 2015, it was published in 2015. The internet and the world have changed since then. So just some examples of things that could be profiled and strongly discouraged in a modern security profile BCP would be to drop support for basic auth when authorizing to Scim service providers, to drop the password attribute off of the user resource, and to sort of clarify on this one, I'm not necessarily proposing a hard, you may never do this ever. There are always going to be sort of the outliers and the edge cases. For instance, Scim talking to some gateway that's talking to a really, really old, like mainframe or something, where the code on it is never going to change. But for one of the really common Scim use cases of cross-domain identity exchange, sort of the cloud flavor of it, passwords really shouldn't be going around. It's federation has taken its place as the way to go, and even just looking at the basic auth piece, there's bearer tokens, there's OAuth, there's other ways to approach this over, and I guess to clarify on basic auth, think like username and password. So if you can't tell by my lack of precision on these terms, I don't really live in the auth world. So adding to yours comment a minute ago, the thing on sort of referenced URL security may also fit into this. But this is a thing also, very happily welcoming any contributors, co-authors, etc. But this is something that I feel is needed.
Phil, did you want me to channel your comment, or do you want to get in the queue? Okay, go ahead, Phil.
I think I've got it. Okay. Yeah, we talked about this before, and it may already be in the security considerations, and I'll double check that. But there are really two scenarios. One is authenticating so you can make calls to Scim as a client, which is using an HTTP authorization header. And it's not a great practice, I agree, to use basic auth, and probably you should never allow that. But there are valid use cases for working with the password attribute, and that's why it's in the schema. And the idea is that a lot of people were using Scim as a directory, and their OpenID provider would call into Scim as a secure client using its credential, and it validates that a password matches. And usually that's part of a whole MFA strategy. So I would say it's a harder question to remove password from Scim schema than it is to simply say it's a really bad practice to use basic auth with Scim. And I'll double check what's 7644 says about it right now.
Yeah, and the approach even for password may be not to remove it, but to just very strongly advise against it unless you we can sort of again it's a best practice to sort of find good reasons, right?
So here's what the spec says right now. Usage of basic authentication should be avoided due to its use of the single factor that is based upon relatively static symmetric secret, and so on and so forth. So the spec already says should be avoided. So you can get, the only thing stronger than you can say is must not, and redraft the whole spec.
If I'm understanding this correctly, these are two completely unrelated example suggestions that Danny is presenting. One is about the client authenticating itself to the service provider, and the other is about just data moving around. So I don't think these were linked together as part of the same issue. And again, I don't think it's necessarily the best time to debate these particular issues right now. This is more just to get the ideas flowing.
Yeah, my intent is to make sure we move forward from the current spec, then try to fix something that's already in the spec. That's all.
Yeah, I'm done. I didn't actually fully catch Phil's last point, but if it's in the notes, I'll read it. Phil, could you repeat that last point, please?
Yeah, I was just saying that I just wanted to point out that if the spec is very clear right now, although it does not say must not, it says should not, and it's not even capitalized. It says should be avoided. If people feel very strongly, I wouldn't be opposed to banning it. But I think it's a much more difficult question on the second issue of you get rid of password entirely, and I don't think the community is ready for that. There's still LDAP out there, for God's sake, so we haven't got rid of that. And so I think that's sort of a key part, and I'm hearing a lot of people really want the opposite. They want credential schema to have more sophistication about credentials, and they actually want not just the password, but they want all the password management features standardized. So password policy, when was the last change, how many failures, all those kinds of things. It may be that whole password is subject as part of a whole MFA schema discussion that we should start, per your point that things have changed in the last 6 years.
Yeah, and that was all I had. So I believe this is the last slide of my set, and we can move on.
Okay, thanks, Danny. Okay, so next up, Phil. You can start with a quick update on the draft. I don't think it'll take you that long, and then we can move to the next.
Yeah, it's probably 30 seconds. The working group had a call for adoption for the events draft that was passed. I asked for, prior to posting it, I asked for co-authors, and thank you, Nancy, for agreeing to help me with the draft. We could probably still use a couple more co-authors. What that usually means is that I'll be talking with the authors more directly at each publication cycle, and hopefully getting help in writing or in editing and so on and so forth. So if anybody wants to co-author, please let me know. I just need a clear indication that you want to do that. I know there were a couple other people, but I wasn't able to, at time of publication, get a confirmation that they wanted to be an actual author.
And
Thanks.
I will clarify, I will speak now as a participant. Since I'm now an author for this draft, I will not be speaking to this draft as a chair. I will relinquish my role as chair to Aaron for this particular draft. Okay.
Yeah, Mike, go ahead.
So, Bill, I'm interested in helping out. So you can hook me into whatever process you have in terms of the spec.
So
Who
Mike,
was that?
you can send Phil an email directly. If you want
Yeah,
to
that'd be great.
participate in the draft. Yeah.
And as for the draft, there was very minor changes, a couple typos and other things. I think we have to start the discussion phase next before you see any major updates. So that's it for that.
Okay, so we can move you to the deck, the coordination use cases deck. Hopefully
Yeah,
you can see them.
thanks. What I thought I saw, at least in the last month, a lot of duplication of efforts going on, or parallel streams that were starting to appear. And I was under the impression that we had made a decision, but it seems like we need to revisit that. So I took the liberty of writing what I saw as the use cases for events and for paging, and comparing the things. I also heard even today things like change detection that could be covered for some people by the Scim events draft, but you may still need change detection as a polling technique. So that's something we should sort out. So I thought the best way to get through this would be to talk about the use cases. What are we trying to solve? And then we can sort of say, okay, what approach really works? I also want to understand the full set of requirements. And also, I think one of the things that's been pointed out, that the environment, just the world of directory services, is dramatically different. So we now have broader security threats. There's signaling going on that we need to do. The scale of servers is much, much bigger than we had with LDAP. And we have to think differently. We now have multiple administrative domains. So if we go to the next slide, I'll get into this a bit. So the overall scenario was there's some relationship between domains, and this might be a single service where there are tenancies talking to another administrative domain, a corporation. There may be multiple clouds involved. So for now, I'm just going to talk about two at a time. And it doesn't really matter what they are. But the point is there are two separate domains. There can be life cycle relationships between users in one domain and another, such as an employee. When the employee leaves the employer, the account, let's say at salesforce.com, needs to be either deleted or suspended or soft deleted. So that's a big question right there. I just gave you three possible outcomes at at Salesforce that might happen in reaction to a change in status in a parent domain. And that's one of the things that's important to observe, is that it's very complex now to go the old-fashioned way of LDAP of saying one domain controls the other, because what we have is a concept of independent control and slightly independent lifecycle management. So while there's a relationship, a trigger that goes between the two, independent action is now more important than ever. So we'll go through this. Let's go to the next slide. So in cursor paging, the idea is that the domain on the left is periodically asking for a logical copy of the entire database on the right so that it can do reconciliation. Now, it may do that in one call, or it may actually use paging, which is what's being asked for, so it can get through the result set. One thing that is a bit of a misnomer is people are assuming that they need to do that because max results is in force. That's kind of a mistake, because max results is an optional feature that the server can use. And also max results should limit the total results, not the page of results. So I just want to be careful to make sure we understand that. But nevertheless, you can accomplish synchronization or coordination between domains by doing a polling technique of retrieving all the entries every periodic 15 minutes or every hour or whatever the cycle is, and then do reconciliation to keep the domains coordinated. What is good about this is that the reconciliation process is deciding what changes in domain B mean to domain A, and then deciding what to do in domain A. On the sort of circle arrow on the left and right side, I'm just indicating that those domains are running independently. They have their own value add, and there are changes that occur independent in each other. That's very different from the old world where we had, let's even 20 years ago, we had meta directory. Nothing happened in domain B unless domain A ordered it. That doesn't happen today. We do have independent operation. There are also cases that I've seen where there may be mutual replications. So take this diagram and flip it around, where domain B wants to know about changes that are going on in domain A just as much as domain A wants to know about B. So next slide. In the event-based system, it's really the same thing. It's the same environment and conditions, except this time, when a server in domain B processes a change, it issues a security event token, which is actually just a JOT, and sends it through a transport mechanism, which could be a message bus, or it could be the set transfer protocol that's already been published, and it sends it over to a receiver in the client domain side on the left. That reconciliation process then happens as it receives each event. Two things that are majorly different. One is the event can be transferred in real time. As soon as it occurs on any particular, say 100 servers in domain B, that server can publish the event directly, or it may route that event to a dispatch server, which collects all the events as a stream and then sends it to its partner. That's really up to the deployer to determine that. But the idea is as close to real time as possible. You get change notices coming to the other side. Those change notices can be notices about the Scim resource itself, this piece of schema, this attribute changed, and so forth. Or they can be things like security event. They could be account status change events. They could be risk events that says there's been a password reset against this user, which then the receiving side can decide what to do. And they might not go to the Scim server or the directory on their side. They may actually send it off to their security team for action there, and there's some other proprietary action. One of the things that comes from security event tokens is that each of these messages are just a simple statement of fact. It's always the receiver that decides what to do in its domain and to infer meaning from that event. That's very different from the world of Scim, where we tell the other side what we want through a create, post, or delete, or patch request. In an event, you're just getting information that you decide to act upon. So next slide. So these are the cases I've covered. There may be more. Well, let's go through them. Next slide. So one of the cases that does keep coming up is how do you initially set up a server? How do you bootstrap it or recover it? I'm not sure either draft right now addresses the problem. It's partially addressed in the current spec with the bulk operation, but in reality, people are probably doing exports to JSON, transporting that file securely to the receiver side, and then they do an import when that happens. We can talk more about this issue, but I think it's a special case problem that, depending on what you have, may be solved in different ways. So for example, if all of your nodes in your Scim service provider are communicating and replicating using a message bus, these days often the message bus technology itself is your recovery mechanism. So if you lose a node, you simply go to the message bus and reload the whole message bus and you're up and running. That's one of the techniques. There are many other techniques, but that's sort of an issue for product managers. I'm not sure it's an issue for us to have to deal with when we're talking about that kind of recovery. Cross-domain recovery is something we need to talk through as a use case and flesh this one out a little bit more. Or cross-domain bootstrap, where you're just setting up a new domain. So I'm a new customer at Salesforce and I need to set up my tenancy over at Salesforce. How do I do that quickly? So that's one case. So the next slide. So in this side case, we have something goes on in the controller side, and it wants to reconcile a change that's concerned on a slave side and reconcile that change. So it wants to pull the change information across and decide what to do locally to keep in sync, or vice versa. It may also decide to make subsequent changes on the remote side, depending on what the policies are, but we're not talking about specifying what gets done. Next. So this is another case. I think this is important because where in the past with LDAP, we didn't standardize replication, because typically customers would be deploying one server across all of their, one vendor, one product across all. So what each product chose to do didn't really matter or impact replication. I don't think that's true today. Based on the provider you're using, might influence which Scim service provider software you implement. And if you're using multiple cloud providers, there's probably lots of people who are going to run into the case where one server is running one service product and another server is running another. And it occurs to me that internal domain replication is a challenge. Another thing that typifies this environment is that you're all in the same security domain. Schema is likely to be the same, and your goal is to copy information between nodes in its whole form. So in this case, when you send a change, you want to send all of the information all at once. When I'm cross-domain, I know that the receiving domain might be interested in the change, but I don't know necessarily what information they're interested in. So that the concern with cross-domain coordination is, don't just send them all the changes that occurred, just send them what they need to know in order to resolve the issue. In internal domain, we'll publish all the replication information so that the other node can be quickly made current. That's really the difference I see between the two cases. Next slide. More and more, it wasn't the case a few years ago, more and more the notion of who's master and who's slave is getting weaker. And I'm seeing more cases where people wanted to have bi-directional event coordination. So that's just something in the back of my mind, that those two diagrams for both paging and both event delivery, you might want to start thinking about throwing away master slave and start thinking about that it's bidirectional. You may have to set policy that says one domain is authoritative over roles, but the other domain is authoritative over photos. Who knows? But it's a little bit more complex than we had even 6 years ago. Thanks. Next slide. This sort of flows out of the risk sharing events under OpenID. People are interested to know about higher level events that come out of a Scim repository, such as a password was changed or an account password was reset, or suspicious activity. There's a bunch of high level events that may be detectable or may be being tracked in a Scim server. We don't have necessarily directly all of the data involved in this, because as I said, we haven't standardized things like password failure counts and things like that. But certainly the side that wants to share that information has built that information with a combination of Scim and other services, and they have that data and they want to be able to share that so that receiving clients can know that they can take independent action. So the other thing, so the scenario that risk sort of worries about is if somebody adds a new authentication factor, they want to make sure that the person adding the authentication factor wasn't somebody stealing the account, and so they change their security policies temporarily on the receiving side to enable account recovery for a period of time. And then once the factor is laid down and it's working, they now know that the account is good to go. Sometimes they're just taking that information and saying, we're going to reset our login sessions and force that user to log in. So that's what signaling is all about, is the ability to take independent action by the receiver and decide what's appropriate based on your own local policies. Next slide. Now I'm looking at this slide on my desktop. It's quite small. I tried to go through a comparison. I will first of all say I'm biased because I started off by looking at paging. My chief concern with paging is that you're only doing it on a certain frequency. It's periodic, whereas events, you're trying to make sure that event gets delivered as in close to real time as you can. And the effort you put into making sure that happens will get you closer to real time. If you decide you're not going to do that, you can still throttle event delivery through whatever mechanism you want to use and say, no, I'm just going to poll for events every 15 minutes. You can go both ways with that. But on the left, my concern has always been downloading the entire data set, particularly if you're talking about billions of users, is a real challenge in terms of raw cost, data exposure. You're exposing all of your data every synchronization cycle. I would prefer to see a way in the Scim coordinated event spec. In fact, the changes don't initially at the event stream doesn't contain raw data. It just contains a notice that an identifier resource has changed. And then the client can go and find out what that change was, and that's how it works. So we share minimal information in that profile, and I think that's why it's a better draft. I think also that the ability to leverage that event mechanism to do things like async signaling. So the bulk request has completed to send security events such as risk signals and other events creates a lot of value, and it sort of fits in with a general pattern between OpenID, OAuth, and Scim as a three-legged security system that can be coordinated. And so that's where I'm coming from. So that's it. And I also would like to invite Danny, and I wish Matt was here to also add where I've missed the benefits of theirs. I do think the paging protocol is relatively simple to specify, but it's much harder in my experience. I know of a lot of databases that can't support cursor-based paging, or if they do, you get problems like thrashing, because what they end up doing is maintaining a copy of the entire database in memory, and that leads to swapping and other things. And if you're a service provider with many tenancies on the same server, you haven't got a lot of memory or a lot of disk to hold multiple copies. If you've got 50 clients doing paging at the same time, you won't have enough memory at all. I still think you could avoid paging by doing a get, as long as the service provider agrees to give you unlimited search results. You could still do a cyclical get, and that can work, and that is really simple. But it still has all the problems of you can only afford to do that only every so often, once a day or once an hour, and that leaves you a 1 hour gap. And is that good enough? So that's it for comparison, and I hope that helps.
Okay, we only have like we're a couple minutes behind. Let's let Danny respond, and then we'll move on.
Hey, Danny with Microsoft. So I did have a chance to speak with Matt Peterson before this. He's unfortunately not able to join us today. So one of the problems, and it comes down to either we would have to specify it in the events draft, or it's left up to the implementers, is that in some implementations of like shared signals transmission, once the signal has been provided and the receiver, and I apologize if I'm using the wrong terminology, once the receiver has responded with 200 OK, the transmitter may not have an obligation to actually hold that message anymore. One of the benefits of cursor-based pagination is that for a limited period of time, that same cursor can potentially be replayed in the event that there's some sort of infrastructure problem, the VM hosting this has gone down, you're able to get your data back. It's solvable on the shared signal side as well. Other things sort of in favor of cursor-based pagination. So just really the infrastructure required, like you as a Scim service provider, the implementing another parameter, set of parameters, some attributes to support cursor-based pagination, it is still going to be the more simple option compared to having to set up whichever elements are needed infrastructure-wise for the shared signals processing. And as a counterpoint to sort of the downfalls from a software engineering standpoint on cursor-based pagination, so Matt's feedback, to paraphrase him, was that there are also a number of existing databases used in identity systems where they natively do cursor-based pagination, and even today to do index-based pagination, they're having to store their results in memory in an index format because that's not natively how they work with the data. I feel like I had other points. I'm losing my train of thought slightly.
Not sure. Why don't I respond to the first couple you made, and then you can add yours, because I don't want to lose the thought. On the set transfer, we did a lot of in the security token, the ID token working group, which sort of took the Scim group and a number of other groups to work together on a common spec. We talked about this, and the issue for many service provider was the sheer number of events that are flowing out, and being able to persist those for long periods of time becomes untenable, or let's just say we didn't get consensus on that. What the group decided is that the transfer spec give you guaranteed transfer, because it's not just a 200. The client responds and acknowledges that an event was received. The responsibility for recovery then becomes the receiver's responsibility. So once that client receiver says, yes, I got that notice, I'm acknowledging it, that tells the service provider it's now allowed to forget about the event. So that's the way it normally works in practice, there's nothing saying that the publisher of the event can't keep the event indefinitely. There's nothing saying that or not. What was wanted was the ability for the publisher to only have to hold events for 2 or 3 days. The idea would be you're syncing, let's say, with Azure, between Google and Azure goes offline, or Google goes offline for 3 days. When a call comes back up, will it get back in sync? That was the level of recovery people were agreeing to. But if we're talking about recovery of a lost server that needs to go back and figure out a month's worth of history since the last backup, that's a different thing, and it would be up to the receiving domain to figure out how they're going to manage that recovery issue anyway. So again, making recovery the client's responsibility gives the client domain full control over their data set and how they do recovery. And it lets the side that's publishing the event not have to worry about the internal problems on a receiver domain. So that, I'm just
Okay,
telling
so-
you what the design is. That's it.
Okay,
Go ahead.
thanks, Phil. Well, so I just wanted to say we're transitioning and we are behind schedule, but the whole notion why I put this presentation ahead, Danny, of this was to trigger the discussion of the use cases as well as the requirements as we see them. That leads us to the notion of we've already adopted the Scim events draft. There's been discussion about adoption of the other 2 drafts, or potentially, right? And so this is where we allocated 40 minutes. We're now down to 20 some odd minutes, right? To get into that discussion of alignment, to drive consensus, amongst the participants here, of at least getting alignment and agreement of these are the use cases and that are driving the requirements that we need to address in the working group. So I think with that, I mean, I'm actually fine because you started talking about the pagination, right? But Danny, I had allotted for you and Janelle to help lead that discussion. It's too bad Matt's not here, so it's not just you and Phil, but others, please feel free to jump in as well.
Yeah, I agree. I wish Matt was here because he can speak to this better than I can. So yeah, I guess the use case behind pagination, and just like full transparency, I work with Scim almost exclusively in the scenario of, we'll call it a centralized client working with a service provider or a set of service providers. And in that case, usually the client is acting as an authoritative source trying to push data elsewhere. In those scenarios, I think pagination is needed for instances, I guess, so it's not just push, it's also pull data potentially, where data is coming from somewhere else in. But in either case, in instances when you want to not only sort of make a suggestion on the state of things, you're sending the data that you have, and there may be other data in a system. When you, as a client, need to sort of be able to see the full state of the external connected Scim system, precisely the problem you said of millions of results. I don't think cursor-based pagination alone solves that. It's probably cursor-based pagination with some sort of delta query together, allowing to paginate a set of results. And even if you have 5 million results, if you're able to first say, give me the results that have changed since the last query, and then break them up into smaller chunks, it's sort of correct me if I'm wrong, isn't that how LDAP lets you do it? Like it's not really reinventing the wheel in a way, right?
Yeah, I don't know if there's an LDAP user here that can speak authoritatively.
Well, my concept was it's Phil here again. The CN equals change log thing in LDAP was rather, in my experience, a description of how not to do things, because it was a common change log. It was very hard to implement good security on that because it's wide open. And if you have multi-tenancies, it becomes very, very complex to secure. And it also has a lot of high value data in it. I would prefer to avoid that pattern if we can. I think Scim is supposed to improve on LDAP, not repeat it.
Yeah, and so I can't speak authoritatively just because I'm starting to get outside of my expertise, but my understanding is that there are a number of other REST APIs, whether for identity or something else, where a Delta query mechanism does exist. Like, so I don't think we're treading, brand new ground so much as adopting a solution that's used elsewhere. The exact engineering pitfalls, I don't think I'm particularly qualified to discuss. But I guess to pivot slightly, I think one of the points of contention is sort of the scope of where the events draft is useful versus cursor-based pagination. And I think there are systems where they could, in lieu of a Delta query and cursor-based pagination, they could just use an event flow to keep track of things. But there are also systems where that's not really feasible. And so the high-level concept of security event tokens containing Scim information, I'm aware of like other people conceiving the idea besides you as well, Phil. Although you're the only one to actually publish a draft. And in the use case that the other group that I've worked with was aware of, or I guess was focusing on, was more around a Scim service provider communicating high priority results or high priority data that could not wait for that next polling cycle that you mentioned, maybe like 3 hours away. So the classic example from sort of an identity like synchronization provisioning standpoint being a client normally pulls data from a human resources provider and uses that to do things downstream, and they do that every 3 hours. And the Scim service provider, which is the human resources organization, they have breaking news that a certain employee has been fired and needs to be terminated immediately, and like whatever happens after somebody's fired, with hostility, we'll call it. And so alerting those high priority changes is the use case that sort of me speaking as an implementer rather than an author or anything first saw when reading your draft.
So
Okay, so Phil,
I just want to add one thing. Yeah.
So Phil, I was just going to channel in the chat when Ting mentioned, I think cursor pagination and events both have its unique use cases. In the area of data sync, I'm just going to read it. I felt we need both, even though the changing event publish should be the primary mechanism to sync the data efficiently. So that kind of triggered a question in that, Danny, if I'm understanding correctly, you're also describing so Phil has the general requirements vis-a-vis, he's articulated the use cases vis-a-vis the requirements from an abstract. You're describing the anecdotal, pragmatic of this is how the deployments are using it today with those anecdotes, right? And then given Wenting's comments, my question to the group that I will pose is, this isn't the first comment that has come through saying, well, maybe we need both mechanisms. So I will pose the question to both the implementers as well as the users of these solutions. If the solution requires support for both of the use cases, meaning if the argument is we need this mechanism for use case A, we need this mechanism for use case B, if there is a deployment that needs to address both use cases, for me, the question is, both the implementers and the deployers, are they willing to absorb, I'll call it the overhead for just generality, of having to support the two mechanisms? And I'm not expecting an answer now, but it is a question that we as a working group need to think about, right? As we're saying, well, we need both, meaning two protocols, two mechanisms, right?
Yeah, I guess since I'm standing in front of the mic, I'll go sit down in a second. I, speaking, more as an implementer, I agree that I think both are needed. I sort of just described my thoughts on the use case, and it's a bit more narrow than some of the examples that Phil has given. Whereas we haven't really ever looked at it, speaking for Microsoft, as a sort of a wholesale, like replication feature to move all data around potentially, like all the changes versus high priority ones. There's definitely a strong preference. I don't think I can speak to say we would never implement, to the level of what Phil has just described as examples. But I think there's a strong preference to be able to do that purely with like operating with the REST API as a client versus also having to have the receiver in place.
So you're saying, as an implementer, you would be okay supporting both mechanisms?
Not quite. So there are certain use cases, such as the human resources high priority change notification of a termination, where implementation makes sense. At the scale of sort of all like replication of changes from side A to side B happening through events rather than through a polling model, my sort of rough understanding, not a hard statement or commitment, is that as Microsoft as an implementer, we would prefer to act primarily as a client and just poll for those changes using cursor-based pagination, a Delta query, and so on, rather than also having to have a listener for the events to come in.
Okay.
And I guess just one final clarify. So in large distributed cloud systems, I think there's maybe a slightly higher risk. When you have like 1,000 or 10,000 or 1,000,000 or whatever little containers running, one of them may go pop off and die and get re-provisioned. So in any scenario where you're receiving something like that, the polling model is a little safer, I think, when the client is a cloud distributed system, because you can go and remake that same request if something happens to one of your many little nodes that are running. And I'm not a software engineer, so if I'm wrong, I'm sorry. I'm sitting
Okay, Phil's been patiently waiting in the queue. So, Phil?
Yeah, I wanted to point out, because people were looking for a complement to Scim events, there's actually two other mechanisms we haven't discussed as well that can be used. One is RFC 7232, which people haven't really looked into because Scim's an HTTP profile, and it does mention e-tags. And what e-tags give you is the ability to put HTTP preconditions on your request. So that means you can say, get this resource as long as it's changed since I last queried it. If the e-tag has changed, the e-tag is just a hash of the resource. So if the resource has changed, give me the resource. So that's what happens on a get. And then on a modify, you can put a precondition that says this condition only applies if the resource hasn't changed underneath me. So that's one of the techniques that HTTP offers, and the Scim protocol spec does specify that support for e-tag. The other mechanism that Scim offers, if you want to know what's changed, is you can do a general query and query meta.lastModified and say since a certain date. That might be somewhat more crude than people want, but those two things are sort of there, and that's what's in the back of my mind as the complement to the event spec. If I need to get a list of identifiers that have changed since its last date, I could do a Scim get, ask for attribute ID, and last modified equals meta dot and that date. So that's already possible in the current spec. We don't need a new spec for that.
Okay, Danny, you're back in the queue, then Pam. So yours, if you can.
Yeah, I think there's hesitance to lean on the meta dot last modified thing. I mentioned it 45 minutes ago probably, because in distributed systems there's way more like times to be kept track of potentially. Just it's harder to get more like to get a certain level of precision in results if there's time drift between different systems. And then with e-tags, my understanding of it. So when you mentioned on the mailing list somewhere in the past month, I went and did a bunch of looking because I've never had to interact with them. That's a resource level hash. So it doesn't necessarily help with the Delta query on a large scale of, if I have a human resources platform with 500,000 resources in it that I'm trying to query, like I can't go and say, give me anything that's changed in the past since I last talked to you 3 hours ago, whichever, right? I want to go see, has Danny changed in the past 3 hours? I'd have to do a whole bunch of requests or bulk requests or whichever.
Phil, I'll just respond. I don't know that precision matters on last modified. You could certainly add a few minutes to that date and you'll get more data than you necessarily want, but I don't see you losing data. It's certainly better than querying everything. So that's there. And e-tag, yes, that's the limitation, is it's a resource level hash. So it only works on specific resources. That's it for me.
Okay, go ahead. Okay, Pam Dingle. Sorry, I forgot to say that before. From Microsoft. So what I think we can debate till we run out of breath, but we really need to get this data in the hand of the engineers that are going to implement. So can I suggest as a next step, we create an analysis, and maybe it's this comparison chart, but with all of the options instead of just two of the options. And we actually create a survey that we can send to as many engineers as we can that we know have implemented Scim 2.0, and try to get those, get answers back in a format then we could collate to understand what it means. Is that possible?
It's possible. It's the notion of posting in the mail list, and then for those who are participating in the Scim to solicit that feedback from their implementers. I call them deployment or / customers, but yeah.
Just from my perspective, I think if you go with paging, nobody's going to bother with event signaling. It looks like it's easy. I tried to implement it in a scalable way. I've run into a number of problems. All the research I have on databases say that cursors are for subsets of data, not whole sets of data, because you either end up locking all the rows in your database. So if you got 1 billion entries in your database and you're trying to lock all the rows, likely won't happen. And then the only other way is what some servers do is they create a virtual copy and they run out of virtual memory, which is a hard thing to do and a very expensive thing to do. And that's why I've been saying it's a denial of service problem that you will have to address, because if the server runs out of memory, that's a great way for a hacker to shut you down. That was a problem in LDAP that I'd like to keep out of Scim. So all those caveats, I think if we choose multiple methods, there has to be a strong reason for paging to exist outside of coordinated replication. Otherwise, you're just going to have half the community does one spec, half the community does another, and you won't have interoperability, and you'll end up either implementing both and be frustrated by that. So I'd rather have one spec than both.
Right. That's why I posed the question. Right.
Yeah.
Because it seems like events is solving a particular use case that is useful. And so for the implementers, that have to support all the use cases? Are they okay supporting both? Danny, you were in the queue?
Hi, Danny Zollner, Microsoft again. Oh boy, what was I gonna say? God, I hate when that happens. Okay, so as I said before, the use case that I see, and like the reason why I think shared or the set Scim thing would still be adopted by some people is that very specific problem of a service provider needing to urgently communicate something back to the client. I can definitely see your concern of if we go ahead with cursor-based pagination, that, and we'll say the combination of cursor-based pagination and Delta query, because they sort of jointly solve a lot of the like large-scale problems, that people would not necessarily implement shared signals to do that instead. So not being able to speak, other than channeling Matt Peterson's words, for instance, on the ease of implementation of one versus the other, like the database and locking memory and all that. I suspect that the majority probably would go with the cursor-based pagination and Delta query unless they were operating more as a source rather than a recipient of data. It's still in a pool model. So, HR provider problem needs to tell somebody that a user was terminated. I've always I've had trouble following in the email threads at first, just because I think the use cases that I've seen you envision, Phil, for the shared signals have been much wider than we originally, speaking on behalf of my colleagues at Microsoft, that we had envisioned ourselves.
Oh, Wen-Ting, you're in the queue?
Can you
Wen-Ting?
hear me now? Can you hear me?
Oh, now we can hear you, but if you can speak a little louder, would be great.
Okay. Let me see. Can you hear me better now?
Yeah, we can hear you fine now.
Okay. So basically, we are doing a lot of integrations with the directory sources and with other like HR systems. I think our experience, at least for my visibility, is that we integrate basically start large system and small system as well. So my feeling is, for one, probably all the includers, they usually, like data sources, they usually start with search functionality. We call it pagination, because that has other use cases like search and other use cases. Usually they start with that and just publish that API rather than unit systems. And we start from, they usually expose those interfaces and we integrate with them. But later on, if they do see use cases for the event, when they run into scalability issues, they start to publish those data changes and things like that in, like, for example, real-time notifications through the event channel, right? So I feel that I'm not sure as a standard or community, do we want to give people choices? Because in reality, people always start with cursor paging and later on with events, right? That just look like a common pattern I run into when I did all the integrations, like my company did all the integrations. That's a common reality. I'm not sure as a community, as a standards body, do we want to force a particular solution more geared toward the large systems, or do we want to give people choices? That's one. The second question is that, like I said, they usually start with a search-based or cursor-based approach, and later on they add events channels when they run into scalability issues or when they really require real-time notifications. In terms of the mechanisms of events, usually there could be like a pub sub systems, or they could use event hooks to notify us in demand, like HR systems to notify termination and something like that in real time with event hooks. So those are the patterns we saw. I just try to share some of the experiences we had here. So.
Thanks, Wen-Ting. In essence, that's the question I posed earlier, right, in the survey to the implementers. Right. The other suggestion I might make, and that goes to Phil, Danny, and and to Matt when he comes back is um, the comparison chart that Phil started is a really good way for us to provide that succinct data, if you will. And so I'd encourage you to do an update to it based on Danny, yours and Matt's feedback and alignment, and then we can bring it back to discussion because I don't know that we have the answers that we need now to get us to a path forward. Any? Okay. So Wenting, the note takers are requesting that you look at the headstock document to make sure that they have appropriately captured the points that you wanted to raise.
Thank you. I will take a look. And another point I want to mention is that also we run into cases where we have to do a full import, like export import, in order to verify fix some of the issues on the data stream in the unit channels. We run into some of the issues where even the data that delta changes that we ingest on the unit channel, sometimes we run into issues cannot be resolved. We have to resort to back to the full import in order to resolve some of the bugs or issues on the unit channel.
You got 2 thumbs up from Danny in case you didn't see that one too. Any other comments? Any other comments or feedback on this topic? Oh, Danny's getting up.
One final thing. This is actually a thought from Matt Peterson when we were discussing this earlier this week. Is that I think we look at the capabilities provided by the events draft as a potential optimization to things like change detection and whatnot versus a replacement to it.
Okay, given that we only have 3 minutes left, I will close this topic and do a quick chair's update. We are behind on our milestones. The chairs do need to update the milestones. And Pam, I think when you put the use cases, Aaron and I can come back and give you a swag on when we can have you target to a working group last call. It may be a living document because it is use cases and we're still teasing out requirements. It may be a question that we put to the mail list of just deferring publication of that until we believe we've agreed on all of the use cases, meaning we can continue to work on the extensions that we need, protocol and schema. Okay. So that's number one. So that one we may stretch out on the milestones. We had said that we would publish a protocol and a schemas. Given the discussions and the way we're moving forward, I see the path of a lot of drafts, so we can take that up in discussion in the mail list of whether there is one or several. That said, we cannot update those milestones until we have that discussion. So for that, we need a couple drafts. And I believe, Danny, you've submitted one of them for the roles and entitlement. So if you can just, as the author, if you can post on the mail list and request feedback and comments. For the chairs, we look for at least 3 individuals who are not authors of the draft to provide any feedback. Well, let me rephrase, constructive feedback, either positive or not, for whether this draft should be considered to be, well, I believe the comments so far, the drafts are considered to be in scope, but more of whether it can serve as a seed, a starting point for us to move forward and progress on a particular topic. Okay? So I think with that, I may just adjourn us unless somebody really has anything burning they want to say in the last 30 seconds. Going once, going twice. All right. Thank you all for participating both remotely and in person. It's been a good IETF 114. We will try and schedule an interim, likely in September, I think is what we were discussing. So we'll put out a doodle poll to pick a date. And then from there, post that interim. We hope to see you in IETF 115, either remotely or in London. Thank you, everyone. Thank you to the note takers. Pam, you are incredibly awesome. No, I like, I mean, for me as a chair to go back and say what was actually discussed really helps. Yeah. And that's totally fine as long as you don't still, which is why I ask other people to review. Right? I don't know if it was you or somebody was clarifying what Pam was trying to say. Right? And I did fix a couple of things. What's that? Yeah, it's like as soon as I get up, I just. So I had sessions where I was agree with them. You saw me, but I do the put it back on. Thank you. Now, will you be able to provide a public report? Yeah. Well, so we have been running a cadence of Wednesdays, but because of work and I would just say put them as Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, and we'll offer like a 7